When you grow up in Appalachia, you hear stories about things that live deep in the woods, far from the roads and trails. Most folks laugh them off as tall tales, but I've seen things that would make you think twice. My name's Travis, and this is what happened on Raven Hill. It started with a delivery job. I work for a small logistics company out of Charleston, West Virginia, hauling goods to places that most GPS systems can't even find. That's how I ended up on Raven Hill Road, a winding stretch of cracked asphalt that seemed to disappear into the mountains. The job was simple: deliver a pallet of canned goods to a tiny store in a hollow I'd never heard of. The pay was decent, and the boss promised I'd be back before nightfall. But the sun was already setting as I drove up the mountain, my old truck groaning on the steep incline. The trees were so dense they blocked out what little light remained, and the road narrowed until it felt more like a trail. Then my GPS cut out. I pulled over to check the map I'd stuffed in the glove box, but before I could unfold it, something caught my eye: a figure standing in the road, about 50 yards ahead. It wasn't a deer or a bear. It was a person. I flicked my high beams on, and they darted into the trees, their movement unnaturally quick. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. Probably just a local out hunting or messing around. I'd seen stranger things living out here. I drove on, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. The first sign that something was wrong came a mile later. A rusted car sat abandoned in a ditch, its windows shattered and its doors hanging open. The ground around it was littered with beer cans and empty snack wrappers, like someone had been there recently. I slowed to a crawl, my pulse quickening. There was no one in sight, but the air felt heavy. The second sign was worse. A little further up the road, I spotted a cabin tucked into the trees. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, but the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were boarded up, the wood gray and splintered with age. But what stopped me wasn't the cabin itself. It was the clothesline strung between two trees, sagging under the weight of what looked like human hair. Long strands, tied into bundles, swayed in the breeze like some kind of grotesque decoration. I hit the gas, my truck lurching forward as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. The road twisted higher into the mountains, the trees closing in until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow looked like it was moving. Then, out of nowhere, something slammed against the side of the truck. I swerved, nearly running off the road, and slammed on the brakes. Whatever it was had fallen into the ditch, and in the glow of my taillights, I saw it. A man, or what used to be one. He was emaciated, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His hair was long and matted, and his clothes were little more than filthy rags. I froze, my hands gripping the wheel, as he got to his feet. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings, and when he turned to look at me, I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the red glow of the taillights, and his mouth hung open, revealing rows of blackened teeth. He let out a sound, a low guttural moan that sent chills down my spine, and then he ran, not away from the truck but toward it. I threw the truck into reverse, slamming the gas pedal. The man, or whatever he was, chased after me, his long limbs propelling him forward at an inhuman speed. As I backed down the road, I saw them. More figures emerging from the trees, pale and feral, their movements unnaturally fast. They surrounded the truck, clawing at the windows and pounding on the doors. One of them climbed onto the hood, their face inches from the windshield, their breath fogging up the glass. I panicked, slamming the truck into drive and flooring it. The figure on the hood slid off with a sickening thud, and I didn't look back. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning as I sped downhill. The growls and pounding faded, replaced by the roar of the engine and my own ragged breathing. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, the lights of a small gas station cutting through the darkness. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, covered in sweat and dirt. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Raven Hill," I gasped. His expression changed, and he shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone up there. Ain't nothing good on Raven Hill." I never told my boss what happened. I just quit the job and left the state, vowing never to set foot in those mountains again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them, the growls, the pounding, and that low, guttural moan. I've never been the adventurous type, but after my breakup, I needed to get out of the city. A friend recommended Wolf Hollow Trail, a remote hiking spot about 3 hours north of town. He described it as serene, off the beaten path, and untouched by tourists. It sounded perfect. My name is Marcus, by the way, and if you're reading this, consider it my warning. Stay the hell away from Wolf Hollow. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the golden light cut through the trees. The trailhead was unmarked, save for a small wooden sign nailed to a tree that simply read, Hollow. No maps, no brochures, just a faint dirt path winding into the dense forest. I should have turned around then, but no. I kept going, craving solitude and silence. The first hour was uneventful. The woods were quiet, almost unnaturally so. The only sounds were my boots crunching against leaves and the occasional bird call. As the trail grew narrower, I noticed strange carvings on some of the trees. Simple at first, crude stick figures, spirals. But the further I went, the more unsettling they became. A jagged eye, a mouth wide open in a scream. I told myself it was kids messing around, graffiti from bored locals. But deep down I felt like I was being watched. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl across the forest floor. I decided to turn back, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I froze. The trail was gone. I spun in place, my chest tightening. Somehow, without realizing it, I'd veered off the path. All around me were trees, endless and identical, their branches clawing at the sky. That's when I heard it. A faint laugh. Not a child's giggle or a friendly chuckle. It was dry, guttural, and full of malice, like it had been dragged out of someone who hadn't laughed in years. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound confident. My voice echoed, bouncing back at me, weaker than before. Then came the crunch of leaves, soft at first, then heavier, deliberate. Someone, or something, was circling me. I grabbed the pocket knife from my pack, gripping it tightly as my eyes darted between the trees. If this is a joke, it's not funny. No reply. But the laugh came again, louder this time. Closer. I broke into a run, not caring where I went as long as it was away. My breath burned in my lungs and the forest blurred around me, but the sounds followed. Footsteps, laughter, whispers. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. Shadows flitting between the trees low and fast. But as I kept running, I caught glimpses. Ragged clothes, matted hair, pale, dirt-streaked skin. They weren't shadows. They were people. Or at least, they used to be. One stepped into my path and I skidded to a halt. He, or it, was hunched and feral, with hollow cheeks and blackened teeth. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural hunger, and his fingers were long, gnarled, tipped with nails like claws. "Please," I stammered, holding up my knife. "I don't want any trouble." He tilted his head almost curiously, then let out a guttural bark that sent a shiver down my spine. More emerged from the trees, a dozen at least. Their bodies contorted and twisted like they hadn't walked upright in years. They moved with jerky, animalistic motions, surrounding me in a loose circle. I knew I couldn't fight them, not all of them. So I ran again, this time straight through them, ducking under their clawing hands and ignoring the searing pain as one raked my arm. The woods erupted with noise, howls, shrieks, and that damned laughter. Branches tore at my face and clothes as I sprinted blindly, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't care where I ended up as long as I was away from them. Finally, I burst into a clearing and saw it. A cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging and the windows shattered. But it was my only hope. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me and shoving an old chair under the handle. For a moment there was silence. just my ragged breathing and the faint creak of the old wood. Then the laughter returned. It surrounded the cabin, echoing from every direction. They were toying with me, like wolves circling their prey. I spotted an old hunting rifle propped in the corner and snatched it up. It was rusty, the barrel clogged with dirt, but I gripped it anyway, praying it would at least scare them off. The first bang on the door nearly stopped my heart. The second sent the chair skidding across the floor. And then they were inside. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. The rifle jamming as I pulled the trigger. Their hands grabbing me, cold and rough. The feeling of being dragged. The ground scraping against my back. The woods closing in, darker and more suffocating than before. When I woke up, I was lying on the edge of the highway, my clothes torn and my body bruised. A passing driver found me and called for help. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. I don't know why they let me go. Maybe they wanted me to tell their story, to warn others. Or maybe they're just waiting, hoping I'll come back. Either way, I'm not going near those woods again, and neither should you. They say there are parts of the country no map can ever truly chart. Places where the wilderness swallows light and sound, and the land itself feels alive. My name is Alec, and I used to laugh at stories like that. I'm not laughing anymore. It was supposed to be a solo backpacking trip, a way to clear my head after a rough breakup. Dead Man's Pass had been a last-minute decision. A buddy had mentioned it offhandedly, calling it a hidden gem for those who craved solitude. The name didn't bother me, in fact, it added a thrill. I'd grown up hiking, camping, and trekking. This was just another trail. The first 2 days were uneventful. The trail was overgrown, barely more than a whisper of dirt winding through ancient pines and rocky outcroppings. I didn't see another soul, but that was the point. Just me, the sound of my boots on packed earth, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But by the third day, things began to change. It started small, little things, easy to dismiss. A low humming at dusk that I chalked up to cicadas. A faint smell, musky and metallic, that lingered on the breeze. Tracks in the dirt that didn't quite match any animal I could name. Too large for a coyote, too narrow for a bear. I took pictures with my phone, thinking I'd ask someone about them later. But the unease I felt as I stared at them wouldn't go away. By nightfall, I'd reached a small clearing and set up camp. I kept the fire low and ate quickly, my eyes darting to the shadows beyond the flames. The night was eerily silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, I heard it. A scream. Not an animal's cry, but something human. High-pitched, shrill, and raw, like a woman's scream cut short. It came from the trees to my left, so sudden and loud that I dropped my fork into the dirt. My heart hammered as I strained to listen. Then it came again, this time from a different direction, and then another, and another. It was all around me. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it into the woods, the beam shaking with my unsteady hand. The scream stopped. The silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I stayed awake that night, clutching the handle of my hatchet, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The fire burned out around 3 a.m., and I didn't dare rekindle it. By morning, I wanted nothing more than to leave. But Dead Man's Pass is not the kind of place you leave easily. The trail back had vanished. Where there had been a worn dirt path, there was now only dense underbrush and jagged rocks. I retraced my steps, or tried to, but the landscape seemed to shift with every turn. Familiar landmarks, a bent tree, a cluster of white stones, were suddenly unfamiliar, as though they'd moved overnight. Then I found the claw marks. 3 deep gouges etched into the bark of a pine tree, high enough that whatever had made them must have been tall. Very tall. The grooves were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds. The metallic smell returned, stronger now. And I realized it wasn't coming from the tree. It was coming from me. I looked down and saw blood, not mine, smeared across the bottom of my pant leg. My stomach churned as I traced the blood to the ground. There, half hidden beneath a tangle of roots, was a fragment of bone. Human bone. A femur, snapped clean in two. I ran. My pack, my gear, none of it mattered. All I could think about was getting away, finding an exit, any exit, from this cursed place. The screams started again as I ran, closer now, and interspersed with guttural clicks and growls. Something was following me. No, not something, some things. I could hear their footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crashing through the underbrush with unnatural speed. I stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive oak tree. Its gnarled branches stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and at its base was something worse than any nightmare I'd ever had. A makeshift altar. Bones piled high, some animal, some not. Charred remains of something, someone, still smoking. And figures. At least 5 of them, crouched low, their bodies covered in matted hair and grime. Their eyes glinted in the dappled light, wide and unblinking, mouths twisted into feral snarls. One of them held a crude blade, its edge jagged and rusted. Another had what looked like a human skull dangling from a leather thong around its neck. They saw me. The first one let out a blood-curdling howl, and the others followed suit. My legs moved before my brain could process what was happening. I sprinted blindly, branches whipping at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I tripped and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, they were there, closing in. Their movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as they loped on all 4s toward me. I don't remember much of what happened next. Just flashes. The taste of copper in my mouth as I bit my tongue, the searing pain of claws raking across my arm, the sound of my own screams mingling with theirs. Somehow, I managed to scramble to my feet and keep running. My body was running on pure adrenaline, my mind screaming at me to survive. Then miraculously, I saw it. The highway. The sight of asphalt and faded yellow lines was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I burst out of the trees, nearly collapsing onto the shoulder. A passing truck screeched to a halt, the driver's wide eyes taking in my bloodied, tattered state. He pulled me into the cab without a word and sped off, leaving the horrors of Dead Man's Pass behind. I told the authorities what I could, but they didn't believe me. Said I'd probably had a run-in with a bear, or got spooked by a mountain lion. They found my campsite, but no sign of the altar, the bones, or the feral beings that had hunted me. It was as though the forest itself had erased all evidence of their existence. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt, and I know this. Dead Man's Pass is not just another trail. It's a place where the wilderness isn't empty, but filled with things that should never see the light of day. If you value your life, stay far away from the screaming trees. It's been 3 years since I last drove that road, and I still can't bring myself to go near it. My name is Mark, and I'm not the kind of guy who scares easily. I grew up hiking trails most people wouldn't touch, camping in places you'd only see in survival shows. But none of that prepared me for the stretch of highway that nearly took my life. It started with a road trip. My girlfriend Sophie and I decided to take a detour on our way to a cabin in the mountains. The highway we were supposed to take was closed for repairs, and GPS offered an alternate route through what looked like a thin, winding line on the map. Old Timber Road, the screen said. Sophie was skeptical, but I waved off her concerns. The road was narrow and cracked, with weeds clawing through the asphalt. It twisted through dense, towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight, giving the whole place a gloomy, greenish hue. Sophie joked about how it felt like driving into a horror movie, but her smile faded when we lost cell service about 20 minutes in. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. At first I thought it was roadkill, a sharp metallic stench that lingered in the air like burnt hair. But it wasn't just one spot. The smell followed us, growing stronger with every mile. I rolled down the windows, but that only made it worse. Then we saw the car. It was an old station wagon, rusted and abandoned, leaning awkwardly into the ditch. The hood was popped, and the tires were shredded. But what caught my eye was the driver's door. It hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. There was no sign of anyone around. No footprints in the dirt. No sound except for the wind rustling the trees. "Let's keep going," Sophie said, her voice tight. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About 10 minutes later, the road narrowed even further, forcing us to slow down. That's when we saw them. At first, they looked like shadows moving between the trees, too quick to make out clearly. I squinted, trying to convince myself it was just deer or some other animal. But then Sophie gasped, pointing to the side of the road. There was a man, or what used to be a man. His hair was matted and tangled, his skin smeared with dirt and something darker. He was crouched low, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing jagged yellow teeth. I honked the horn instinctively, and he flinched, scuttling back into the woods like a spider retreating into its web. "What the hell was that?" Sophie whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know," I muttered, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. The road stretched on endlessly, each curve looking eerily similar to the last. The forest grew denser, the trees leaning in as if trying to swallow the car whole. And then the shadows came back. They weren't trying to hide anymore. Figures darted across the road, their movements unnervingly fast and deliberate. Some of them paused, standing in plain view for just a moment before disappearing into the trees. They were all filthy, their clothes tattered and hanging off their gaunt frames like rags. "We need to turn around," Sophie said, panic rising in her voice. I wanted to agree, but there was no room to turn. The road was too narrow, the drop-offs on either side too steep. We were trapped, forced to keep moving forward. That's when the first rock hit the car. It came out of nowhere, smashing into the windshield with a crack that made Sophie scream. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, but before I could react, another rock hit the side of the car. Then another. They were throwing them. Those things. Those people. I could see them now, emerging from the trees like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. I floored the gas, the tires screeching as we tore down the road. The car bounced and jolted over potholes, the undercarriage scraping against the uneven asphalt. Sophie was sobbing, clutching the dashboard as rocks and sticks rained down on us from both sides. And then we hit something. It wasn't an animal. It was one of them. A man, his face twisted in a snarl, his hands clawing at the hood as we plowed into him. He rolled over the windshield, his body thudding onto the roof before sliding off the back. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The road finally widened enough for me to swerve into a clearing. I spun the wheel, skidding to a stop as the car's engine sputtered and died. Sophie was shaking, her face pale and streaked with tears. For a moment there was silence. Then, we heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching through the dirt. They were coming. "Sophie, run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the trees. We sprinted blindly through the forest, the branches clawing at our clothes and faces. I could hear them behind us, their guttural voices echoing through the woods like some twisted language. We stumbled into a ravine, sliding down the muddy slope until we hit the bottom. My ankle twisted painfully, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Sophie pulled me to my feet, her eyes wide with terror as we stumbled toward the sound of rushing water. The river was fast and cold, the current strong enough to sweep us away. But it was our only chance. We plunged in, the icy water stealing the breath from my lungs. I looked back once, just in time to see them standing at the edge of the ravine, their dark silhouettes illuminated by the moonlight. They didn't follow us into the water. They just stood there, watching. We made it out hours later, soaked and shivering, miles downriver. A park ranger found us the next morning, and I'll never forget the look on his face when we told him where we'd been. "Old Timber Road," he said, shaking his head. "You're lucky you got out. Most people don't." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but Sophie stopped me. She didn't want to know, and honestly, neither did I. We've never talked about it since. But sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I think I see them. Those eyes watching from the trees, waiting for me to take the wrong turn. My name is Ethan, and what I'm about to share with you still feels more like a fever dream than reality. But the scars on my arm and the nightmares that jolt me awake every night remind me it was real. If you've ever thought about cutting through Backroads to save a few minutes, I hope my story makes you reconsider. It was late October, and the crisp chill in the air hinted at the approaching winter. I'd spent the weekend visiting an old college buddy in Denver, and the drive back to Utah felt like it would never end. Somewhere along Highway 40, my GPS started acting up, claiming there was a faster route through a series of side roads. Normally, I wouldn't trust it, but I was tired, and the idea of getting home even 30 minutes earlier was too tempting to pass up. The turnoff led me onto a dirt path barely wide enough for my sedan. Dust billowed in my headlights, and the forest grew thicker with every mile. It was unsettling, but the GPS insisted it was a legitimate route. After about 20 minutes, I came across a hand-painted wooden sign nailed to a tree. "No trespassing. Turn back." It looked old, and the paint was faded. My gut told me to stop, but the road ahead seemed clear. I figured the sign was meant for people trying to camp or hunt in the area. I wasn't planning to stop. I'd just drive through. The first hint that something was wrong came when I noticed the silence. The rhythmic crunch of gravel under my tires was the only sound. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. Then I saw it. A figure darted across the road, too fast for me to make out any details. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. My headlights illuminated a stretch of empty road ahead. "Just a deer," I muttered to myself, though my voice wavered. But as I pressed on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, and every so often I thought I caught glimpses of movement among the trees. I was debating whether to turn around when my car jolted violently. The sound of metal scraping against a rock echoed through the night. Cursing, I stepped out to inspect the damage. My front tire had hit a jagged rock, and the rim was bent beyond repair. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, no spare tire, and night falling fast. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that froze me in place. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human, but distorted, like someone imitating a wolf. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the trees. For a moment I saw nothing but the dense forest. Then a shape stepped into the beam of light. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His body was emaciated, his skin caked with dirt and scars. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's. And his teeth. They were filed into jagged points. He cocked his head, studying me with a curiosity that made my stomach churn. Then he smiled. A sickening, predatory grin. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. And that's when I noticed the others. They emerged from the shadows one by one. 5 of them, maybe 6. Their bodies were twisted, as though years of living feral had turned them into something other. They didn't speak. They just stared, their breaths visible in the cold air. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the car, slamming the door shut and locking it just as one of them lunged. His filthy hands clawed at the window, leaving streaks of grime on the glass. The others surrounded the car, their faces pressed against the windows, leering at me. One of them began to rock the car back and forth, their strength far greater than I'd expected. In my panic, I fumbled for the keys and tried to start the engine. It sputtered but refused to turn over. I banged the steering wheel, screaming at the car to start, when a loud crack shattered the chaos. One of them had picked up a rock and smashed it against the windshield. The glass spider-webbed but held for now. Desperation clawed at my throat as I realized the car wouldn't protect me for long. I grabbed my flashlight and my pocket knife, pathetic I know, and made a break for it. I sprinted into the woods, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me I could hear them giving chase, their growls and whoops echoing through the trees. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and gnarled roots. I tripped and fell more times than I can count, my legs screaming in protest. The flashlight flickered, threatening to die. And that's when I saw it, a dilapidated hunting cabin just ahead, I threw myself against the door, forcing it open, and slammed it shut behind me. The interior was worse than I'd imagined: moldy walls, broken furniture, and the unmistakable stench of decay. But it was shelter, and right now, that was enough. I shoved a heavy cabinet against the door and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. For a moment there was silence. I dared to hope that I'd lost them. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. They didn't try to force the door. Instead, they began circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, their nails scraping against the wood. It was a game to them, and I was the prize. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the knife and flashlight like lifelines. Hours, maybe. The tapping stopped, but I didn't dare move. Then, just as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, I heard the creak of the door. The cabinet I'd pushed against it shifted slightly. My breath caught in my throat as the door opened a fraction of an inch. And then, nothing. No hands reaching in, no faces peering through. Just the wind whistling through the gap. Cautiously, I approached the door, knife in hand. I swung it open, expecting an ambush, but the porch was empty. They were gone. I don't know why they left or what stopped them, but I didn't wait to find out. I ran until I found a main road and flagged down the first car I saw. The police didn't believe me, of course. They said the ferals were just my imagination, maybe some drifters messing with me. But I know what I saw. And now, every time I drive past a wooded area, I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting for their next victim. If you've ever driven through the backroads of Appalachia, you'll know how easy it is to feel lost, even with a GPS. Twisting paths, steep cliffs, and endless trees make it feel like you're driving into another world. My name's Claire, and last summer, I made a mistake I'll never forget. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. My boyfriend Sam and I had rented a cabin in the mountains for some much-needed R&R. The directions seemed simple enough. Follow the main highway, then take Black Hollow Road straight to the cabin. But as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of crimson, our GPS lost signal. "No worries," Sam said, gripping the wheel confidently. "We're almost there." I wasn't so sure. The road narrowed the farther we went, the asphalt giving way to gravel. Thick trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches creating a canopy that blocked out the fading light. "We should turn back," I murmured, clutching my phone, useless without signal. "Relax," he said with a grin. "We're probably just a mile away." We weren't. As the road curved sharply, the car's headlights illuminated a rusted old sign nailed to a tree. "No trespassing." "Sam," I started, but he just shook his head. "It's fine. Probably for the hunting season or something." Another mile passed, and then the car shuddered to a halt. "What the hell?" Sam muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but refused to start. "Great," I said, glancing nervously out the window. The forest was unnervingly silent, not even the chirp of crickets to break the stillness. "I'll check under the hood," Sam said, grabbing a flashlight. I stayed in the car, hugging myself against the chill creeping in through the windows. The sun was completely gone now, and the darkness felt alive, pressing against the glass. The sound of Sam fiddling with the engine was a comfort, until it stopped. "Sam," I called, leaning out the open window. No response. "Sam, this isn't funny," I yelled, stepping out into the night. The flashlight lay on the ground, its beam casting eerie shadows over the trees. And Sam was gone. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the area, my heart pounding. "Sam!" The only answer was the crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, the beam catching movement, just a flicker, something slipping between the trees. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. A low, guttural growl sent shivers down my spine. Then I saw them. At first I thought it was an animal. A crouched figure, pale and emaciated, its limbs impossibly long. But as the light hit its face, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like a predator's, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, rows of jagged teeth gleaming. I screamed and bolted back to the car, slamming the door and locking it. The thing stepped into the road, tilting its head as if studying me. Then it stood up. It was impossibly tall, its body hunched, but still towering over the car. Long, greasy hair clung to its face, and its ribs jutted out like jagged rocks beneath its skin. More figures emerged from the trees, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they weren't used to walking upright. I fumbled with my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen remained blank. One of them slammed a hand against the window, the glass vibrating with the force. Another crawled onto the hood, peering at me through the windshield with a sickening grin. I don't know how long I sat there trembling as they surrounded the car. But then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched whistle cutting through the air. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the sound in unison. For a moment I thought they might leave. Instead, they turned their attention back to me, more frenzied than before. The one on the hood began clawing at the glass, its nails screeching against the surface. Another slammed its fists against the side of the car, denting the metal. I had no choice. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and bolted, flashlight in hand. I didn't know where I was going, just away. The woods seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees, the sound of snapping branches and guttural growls chasing me. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering out of my grip. As I scrambled to my feet, I felt it. A hand, cold and bony, grabbing my ankle. I kicked and screamed, the flashlight's beam flickering wildly. It released me, but the others were closing in, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening shot rang out. The creatures scattered, their inhuman cries echoing through the woods as they disappeared into the shadows. A man emerged from the trees, holding a shotgun. He was grizzled, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes were sharp. "You shouldn't be here," he said gruffly, helping me to my feet. "My boyfriend," I gasped. "He's gone," the man said, his expression grim. "You're lucky they didn't take you too." He led me back to the road, where an old pickup truck was parked. As we drove away, he didn't say much, just kept glancing nervously at the trees. When we reached the nearest town, I asked him who or what those things were. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to," he said. I never saw Sam again, and I'll never drive down Black Hollow Road. My name is Laura, and every time I drive past Broken Spur Road, my hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter. It's been 2 years since I got out of there alive, and yet the nightmares haven't stopped. It all started with a wrong turn. My GPS had gone haywire somewhere on the backroads of Montana, leading me farther and farther away from civilization. I was heading to a friend's cabin for the weekend, a girl's getaway in the mountains. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange, and I was still miles from where I needed to be. Then I saw it, a rusted sign half hidden by weeds. "Broken Spur Road," it read. My GPS chimed in with a cheerful, "Turn right," and I obeyed, thinking it was just another shortcut. The road was little more than a dirt trail, rutted and uneven, winding through dense pine forest. As I drove, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at the edges of my vision. I rolled down the window to let in some fresh air, but the scent that hit me was anything but refreshing. A mix of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something metallic. About a mile in, I realized I hadn't seen another car or house. Just endless trees and shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. My headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the road grew narrower with each passing minute. That's when I saw the figure. At first I thought it was a deer, a flash of movement just beyond the beams of my headlights. But as I slowed the car, I saw it more clearly. It was a man, or something that looked like a man. He stood hunched at the edge of the trees, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his body wrapped in filthy, tattered clothing. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and when he grinned, his teeth were jagged and yellow. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with that awful grin. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. When I looked up again, he was gone. I should have turned around. I should have thrown the car into reverse and gotten the hell out of there. But the road was too narrow, and the thought of backing up in the dark, with those trees pressing in on all sides, was almost as terrifying as the man himself. So I kept driving. The farther I went, the worse it got. Shapes moved in the shadows, always just out of sight. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of decay. My car's engine began to sputter, the headlights flickering as though something was draining their power. And then I heard it. A sound that will haunt me forever. Footsteps, not behind me, but above me. On the roof of my car. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving from the back of the car toward the front. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my eyes locked on the road ahead. I didn't dare look up. The footsteps stopped directly above the driver's seat. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, a hand slammed against the windshield. It was pale, almost gray, with long, bony fingers that left streaks of grime as they dragged across the glass. I screamed and hit the gas, the car lurching forward. The hand slipped away, and I heard a thud as whatever it was rolled off the roof. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. The road twisted and turned, my tires skidding on loose gravel. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of there. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I saw the faint glow of a gas station sign in the distance. I pulled into the lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. The attendant looked up from behind the counter as I stumbled inside, my face pale and streaked with tears. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "There's something on that road," I stammered. "Broken Spur Road. They were on my car, they were—" He held up a hand, his expression darkening. "You're lucky to be alive. Most folks who take that road don't come back." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The shadow walkers. That's what we call them. Been out there for generations, living in the woods, preying on anyone dumb enough to wander in. Ain't human, not anymore." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy. But the look in his eyes, the grim set of his jaw, told me he was deadly serious. I never went back to Broken Spur Road, and I never will. But sometimes late at night I hear things. The creak of footsteps on the roof, the faint tap of fingers on glass. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for their next victim.